Hi, everyone. Thank you to those who have joined us thus far for today's event. We are going to wait just a few seconds to let others hop on before we get started, but thank you for joining us. All right, we will go ahead and get the ball rolling for today's session. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Higher Education, Lessons Learned in Developing and Testing a Cannabis-Specific Peer-Led Workshop. My name is Emma, and I'll be your moderator for today. I am the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, or we call it IHEC for short, and I'm very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few little housekeeping items to go over about today's platform that we are using. So you are using GoToWebinar currently, and if you are new to it or maybe not so familiar with it, I'd like to point out a few things. All of the attendees for today's presentation will be muted throughout the webinar, but that doesn't mean that we still don't want you to participate, and we have some ways that you can do that. So on that control panel on the right of your screen, you'll see different sections, and there's one that says questions. And in that questions section, you can open up that box and then you can type in. So if you have any questions throughout today's session, maybe something the presenter talks about, or you'd like more information, anything like that, feel free to put your questions there, and we'll have a few times throughout the session where we can address those questions. And we'll also have time at the end to go over questions as well. So feel free to use that at any point if you have anything that comes up, and we'd love to address all of those. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to today's speaker, Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today and for presenting, and we are very excited.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm excited as well. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Higher Education. My name is Rachel Askowitz, and I just graduated with a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Miami. So let's get started. Sorry. All right. So for the past 2 years, I have served as the graduate public health intern at the Sandler Center for Alcohol and Other Drug Education at the University of Miami. And actually, starting tomorrow, I will be the health educator at Student Health Services at the University of Miami. But today, I will only be talking about something that I worked on during my time at the Sandler Center. So I'm going to provide a little background on the Sandler Center just to give you an idea of what we do. So the Sandler Center for Alcohol and Other Drug Education is located at the University of Miami, which is a private institution in South Florida with about 10,000 undergraduate students. We're housed in the Dean of Students office, and we are a comprehensive prevention, intervention, education, and referral program. We focus on alcohol and other drug use, misuse, and dependency. Through peer education and collaboration with campus and community partners, we provide outreach and support with the goal of empowering students to make informed and responsible decisions. Our programming takes many different forms, such as weekly pop-ups in our health hub, which you can see on the bottom right of the screen, collaborative events, presentations, and peer-led workshops, one of which I will speak about today. And our team is comprised of a director who is also an assistant dean of students, 2 graduate students, including myself, and 6 undergraduate peer educators. So, sorry. I'm having a little trouble with the PowerPoint. All right. So at the University of Miami, there is an unofficial student culture of work hard and party harder. And this isn't helped by the fact that Miami has a huge party scene, as some of you may know. And this is reflected in our students' alcohol and drug use. So particularly related to cannabis, we see that 14% of first-year students before arriving indicate that they have used cannabis in the past 2 weeks. And this is higher than the national aggregate of 11%. And among first-year students, cannabis is the second most used drug, only behind e-cigarettes. Despite these statistics, though, before the workshop that I'm going to talk to you about today, University of Miami did not have any educational programming for students that violated a cannabis-related policy on campus. These students were actually attending an alcohol-related workshop, which obviously doesn't make a lot of sense and didn't really address any of the issues at hand. So to fill this gap in educational programming, I was tasked with creating an hour-long cannabis-specific peer-led workshop with the main purpose of providing students with the information that they need to make informed decisions regarding cannabis. And this workshop was one of my main responsibilities in my position at the Sandler Center. And just so you all know, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the word cannabis, just as we do in our workshop. And this is because cannabis is all-encompassing of the many ways that the drug can be consumed. It refers to the entire plant, while marijuana just refers to the flower part. So now I'm going to talk about the process that I went through in developing this workshop. So the first step was to do some research. So I reviewed our own alcohol-related workshop. I also looked to some other schools to see what they were doing, and I couldn't find a lot that was at least publicly available. So I decided to start from scratch and make a workshop that was specifically for students. So the next step then was to decide how I was going to approach the workshop and ensure that it was evidence-based. So I decided to mainly base the workshop off of harm reduction theory and health belief model. And I'm going to very briefly go over the two of those theories in case there are some people that are unfamiliar. So the basic principles that I took from harm reduction theory is the recognition that some ways of using drugs are safer than others. And while abstinence is ultimately the goal, harm reduction theory supports any steps in the right direction. And that it's important to meet drug users where they're at in regards to both their motivations and their ability to change. It also emphasizes using an approach that's non-judgmental and non-coercive. So I kind of have these principles in the back of my mind when writing the script of the workshop and in training our peer educators to lead the workshop. I also incorporated these concepts into our goal setting portion of the workshop, which I'm going to explain a little bit later, but we very heavily emphasize making realistic goals. Realizing that it isn't realistic to expect students to completely quit using cannabis. So I also infused the main principles of health belief model into many sections of the workshop. So the health belief model is a theoretical model that is often used in guiding health promotion and disease prevention programs. And basically what it says is that a person's willingness to change their health behaviors is due to 6 main factors. So the first is perceived susceptibility. So this is someone's subjective perception of their risk of acquiring an illness or some sort of health problems, such as lung problems, let's say. Then there's perceived severity. And this is someone's feelings on the seriousness of contracting this illness or health problem. And when thinking about this, people often consider the medical consequences and the social consequences. The third concept is perceived benefits. So this is someone's perception of the effectiveness of a certain action and its ability to reduce the threat of that illness or health problem. So the perceived benefit of, say, reducing their cannabis use. Then there's perceived barriers. So this is someone's feelings on what obstacles or what can get in the way of them performing this health action. So what would get in the way of them reducing their cannabis use. Cues to action is the next concept. So this is a stimulus needed to trigger the process of adopting the health action. And finally, self-efficacy. So this is someone's confidence in their ability to successfully perform a certain health action. So how realistically they feel they can reduce their cannabis use. So these constructs are also embedded throughout the workshop. We give students information to influence their perceived susceptibility and their severity of certain health problems related to cannabis use. We ask them to consider their perceived barriers to reducing their cannabis use, and through discussion, we help them come up with solutions to their particular barriers. And we also have sections on goal setting and resources available to them to help them with self-efficacy. So then the next stage was writing and refinement. And there were many different stages of writing and refining the workshop. So I wrote the first draft and I gave it to our peer educators from last year. I had them provide very detailed feedback, which I then incorporated into the next draft. And then we kind of went back and forth many times with me incorporating their feedback, showing it back to them, and so on and so forth. The workshop has also changed a lot in its first year of facilitation, and I will get into some examples later. Then the final step was training 2 of our peer educators to start off facilitating the workshop. I trained them both in content and in facilitation skills. But I do want to note that our peer educators undergo training at the beginning of every year, so they are already familiar with presenting on alcohol and other drug-related topics and on facilitating discussion. So the final product of this process was a facilitation guide to be used by the peer educators and an accompanying PowerPoint. So on the screen, you can see an excerpt from our facilitation guide from our section on perceived risk. As you can see, it's written in the form of a script for our peer educators to use. It contains notes for them in italics and with an arrow, and also suggested discussion questions in gray text boxes. And while this provides a very basic outline of the workshop, the peer educators are not expected to read it word for word, nor should they. They're encouraged to think on their feet, to respond to the specific comments and questions that come from the students, which varies greatly depending on who is in the room, and to facilitate discussion that goes beyond just the initial conversation starters in this guide. But I do encourage the peer educators to become very familiar with the guide before they facilitate. So now I'm going to briefly go over the main components of the workshop. So these can be broken down into 5 pillars. So the first would be personal reflection, and we focus on this from the very beginning of the workshop. We ask students at the very beginning to take a brief online assessment, which allows them to evaluate their current use of cannabis and how it's affecting their lives. So we do this at the beginning of the workshop so that it stays in the back of their minds as we go through the rest of the activities. And then eventually when we get to the goal setting section, we revisit it at the end of the workshop. So here are some screenshots from the online assessment that we used. It's on a website called howdoyouscore.org. And they have screenings for a variety of problems such as drinking, anxiety, mood swings, gamblings, and more. And we have students take the screening for difficulties for controlling my substance use. And once they click on that, they're able to click on cannabis specifically. We have them do this on their phones, and it only takes them about 5 minutes. And here are some examples of some of the questions that the assessment asks. So in the past 3 months, how often have you used the substances that you've checked? So cannabis. The next one, during the past 3 months, how often have you failed to do what was normally expected of you because of your use of cannabis? The last example, have you ever tried and failed to control, cut down, or stop using the below substances? And the end result will let them know their risk for substance use problems. And as the screenshot says, this is not an actual diagnosis, which we make very clear. but rather a way just to make them more aware of how cannabis is affecting them. It also provides a list of resources when the students scroll down, a list of resources at both the University of Miami, but also in the general Miami area that they can use. And they are able to either send it to themselves, email it, or save it to their phones so they can reference it at a later time. So after the reflection portion, we move on to perceived risk. And this relates back to the concepts that I talked about from the health belief model. And this is when we use an online polling software to see how students compare the risks of cannabis to the risks of other drugs. Then we talk about what are the common misconceptions that they have about cannabis and how might that be influencing how they perceive the drug. And we talk about this during our fact versus myth section, which aims to correct those misconceptions. We have found that the best way to encourage productive discussion is through interactive activities, and we have many throughout the workshop. The perceived risk section and the correcting misconception sections are both done through interactive activities, and I will show you both in a little bit. And this allows the peer educators to maintain the balance of, having a sense of authority and providing factual information, but also maintaining relatability as a student. So the next section then is goal setting. Every student that comes into our workshop is very different. They have very different motivations, needs, different patterns of their cannabis use, but we want to make sure that the information that we're giving them is applicable to their lives, to all of their lives. So we have students write down SMART goals, so goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And this is when we remind students to think back to the results from the brief assessment from the beginning of the workshop, and we really challenge them to think critically about how cannabis is affecting their lives. So the peer educators will ask them questions like, has your use of cannabis interfered with your work at school, your job, or your home life? Have you given up on things that you used to enjoy because of cannabis? Has your cannabis use become a financial burden? Are you worried about job applications or drug tests? And we usually find that students will find this very cheesy at first, but once the peer educators challenge them to really reflect on themselves and ask these questions, we usually find that most of them will take the time to write down a meaningful goal. And this time at the end of the workshop to reflect again on themselves allows the students to use the information that they have been presented to make healthier choices for themselves, which is the ultimate goal of the workshop. So are there any questions that anyone has before I move on to some of the more specifics of the workshop and some of the lessons learned?
Yeah, Rachel, thank you so far for what you shared with us. At this time, we don't have any questions, so we can pause just for a few seconds and see if anybody does have any they'd like to type in, and otherwise we can just move forward.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, should I move on?
Yep, you can go ahead and go.
Okay, great. So, all right. So now I'm going to show you some of the interactive parts of our workshop that we have found to be very successful. So the first is the use of Mentimeter, and that is an online software that can be used for many different types of polling that can actually be integrated right into the PowerPoint. And we have found that students respond very well to the interactive technology, and we use it many times throughout the workshop. So this is just one example. We ask students to rank alcohol, cigarettes, cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis, and heroin on a scale from 1, not risky at all, to 10, very risky. So usually this screen that you see would start off blank, and then as the students start filling it out, the circles and the lines will move depending on the average of what students are saying. And this is a screenshot from one of our workshops after 8 students filled it out. And you can see that students rank cannabis as not risky at all, compared to the other drugs. So this is when the peer educators would ask the students why they ranked cannabis where they did in relation to the other drugs. And then based on what the students say, the peer educators will facilitate further discussion. So then we connect this to our next section, which is our correcting misconceptions section. And that way, the way that students rank cannabis may be based on common misconceptions that people have about the drug. So in our fact versus myth activity, we address some of those misconceptions and provide some clarity on them. All right, so the overall purpose of our fact versus myth section is to show students the health-related consequences of cannabis use, as well as its relation to the law and policy, because that's something that our students are very interested in because they are involved in the conduct process. So we have a total of 8 different statements that the peer educators will ask students to evaluate as either a fact or myth. And the peer educators will hand out signs that say fact on one side and myth on the other. And students are asked to, after the statement is read, to hold up either fact or myth. So on the screen are pictures from the actual slides that we use in our workshop. And the first statement says, cannabis and cigarette smoke can have similar effects on the lungs. So then they ask, is this a fact or myth? And then the peer educators would ask a few students before moving on why they said it was a fact or myth. And this is especially if there's differing answers. So if everyone says the same thing, they'd probably just move on. But usually if half the room is saying fact and half is saying mixed, then they'll ask a few students to explain why they said that. So then they would say it's a myth. And then they'd click onto the next slide, which has some information, and they would explain some of it, but the peer educators usually would have a discussion at this point. And as I'll talk about later in the presentation, this is one of the parts of our workshop that has been reworded and altered many, many times. And this is because, as you can imagine, students get very defensive of cannabis at this point when it's being compared to cigarettes. So then here's another fact versus myth statement, and it's one that our students usually find very interesting. So it says, cannabis improves the quality of your sleep. And they would say, fact or myth? It's a myth. And this is where our peer educators would explain that, yes, it's true that cannabis can help people fall asleep faster, and it often leads people to feeling like they've slept very deeply. But that's because using cannabis before bed can actually lead to an extension of stage 4 or deep sleep, but at the same time, deprivation of REM sleep, which is very important for brain functioning, and a lack of REM sleep is associated with many problems that are listed on the slide. And students are actually very surprised to hear this, which they express, and it has been one of our most convincing and successful fact versus myth statements. So now I'm going to go into some of the successes and challenges that we have had in developing and testing this workshop. So one of our biggest challenges has been wording, especially in the fact versus myth section. Like I said, students get very defensive when they see a statement on the screen that they don't like, and they very often challenge the peer educators on the wording of the statement. And this will lead to them completely disregarding the point that the peer educators are trying to get across. And the peer educators will spend so much time defending the wording on the slide that all productive discussion is lost and a lot of time is wasted. And this is something that we learned very quickly in the first few times that the workshop was facilitated, and wasn't something that we were necessarily anticipating to be as bad as it was. So we have spent a lot of time rewording these statements in this section, and this is one example of the ways that one statement that I presented earlier has changed. So the first time we facilitated the workshop, it said, cannabis isn't as bad as cigarettes, which was met very, very harshly because it was vague. So we changed it to be more specific, that cannabis smoke does not harm lung health. But then this statement was met with total agreement. All students said myth, there wasn't any discussion, and they all just kind of moved on. So we wanted to change it again to kind of bring back some of that discussion. So we changed it again to cannabis and cigarette smoke can have similar effects on the lungs. We expect that future changes will probably be required, but we're very committed to remaining flexible and open and making changes based on how the workshop goes each time. So I'm going to show you just another example of something that has changed many times. Whoops. So we started out with saying driving while high is safer than driving drunk. And this was also met very harshly because we said it was a myth. And students didn't like comparing driving high to driving drunk. So we changed it to driving high does not increase your chance of getting into an accident, which again, similar to the last example, this was met with total agreement that this was a myth, and they very quickly moved on and there was no discussion. So we decided to change it again to, in regards to impairment and risks, driving while high is similar to driving drunk. So students really do not want to be in this workshop, and they will find any way to fight the peer educators. And that's why we have spent so much time trying to make the wording as good as it can be. We sometimes, me and the two peer educators that have facilitated, we would sit in our office and spend 20 minutes debating just one word. But we have found that this is necessary to ensure that we're getting our points across in a productive way. So another challenge that we have had has been student pushback. And this is just in general, not just regarding wording. We very often get statements like the ones that you can see on the screen. So no one has overdosed on weed. It's fun. It's all natural. It's legal where I come from. Or, everything is bad for you. What about GMOs? Or I love the plant. And in training, I try to help the peer educators come up with ways to respond to this type of pushback. And I actually have a few examples of some common statements in the facilitation guide and some ways that they can respond to it. But mostly it comes from experience. So they try to approach this in a way that is as non-confrontational as possible, but still trying to present the students with the facts. But sometimes with some of the more out there statements, it's sometimes better just to move on. And over time, our peer educators have learned when it's a good idea to respond and when it's sometimes better just to move on. So despite some of these challenges, we are very proud of the successes that we have had so far with this workshop. So it has been facilitated 6 times so far over the last school year with 55 students attending. And here are some data that we have collected. We have students take a very brief survey at the end of the workshop. We use a platform called Campus Labs to collect the data, and students use our iPods to fill out the survey. So we asked the question, percent of students that have attended the workshop have said yes, and 35% have said that they are considering it. And in our eyes, this is a big success. I honestly didn't really expect anyone to say yes, so this is something that we are very proud of. So our survey also asked students how much they agree with multiple statements related to the workshop. So here are just some highlighted results. So 84% of students agreed that they have a better understanding of the consequences of cannabis use on health and overall well-being as a result of this workshop. 93% agreed that the peer educators who presented were knowledgeable on the topic, and 86% agreed that the workshop was engaging. So we believe that a lot of the success of our workshop comes from the fact that it is led by students. Our peer educators introduce themselves at the beginning of the workshop as undergraduate students, just like everyone in the workshop, and they state that there are no deans, no administrators, no officials present in the room at any time. Our peer educators also are very ready and able to adapt to the group that's there that day, and they really listen to what everyone is saying. We also find that the interactive portions of our workshop works to keep people engaged as the workshop progresses, we have found that people tend to really open up more and are more willing to participate. We have also seen that laying out the room and the tables and chairs in a U shape or a semicircle is more beneficial for discussion as opposed to classroom rows because everyone can see each other during discussions, and also during our fact versus myth section, they can see what their peers are holding up with their signs. So we have learned many lessons over the course of developing and testing the workshop in its first year. And I'd like to share some of these lessons with you in the hope that you can take them and apply them to your own programming, especially if it deals with a controversial topic like cannabis. So the first lesson that we've learned is that it's necessary to meet students where they're at in terms of their drug use. And this relates back to the use of harm reduction theory, which I mentioned earlier. Something that we do that I think really works is that we acknowledge in the workshop that cannabis isn't all bad. And we think that this is very important to do. Our first two statements of the fact versus myth activity actually talk about some of the potential health benefits of cannabis and that it does have lower risks compared to other drugs. By doing this, the peer educators are signifying to the students that they understand the realities of cannabis use and they therefore come across as more relatable and non-judgmental. Another lesson that we have learned has been finding the happy medium of group size. And we achieved this through a lot of trial and error. So there have been workshops with 20 people, and the peer educators will come back and tell me that they had to spend so much of the time defending the slides, and they felt very ganged up on, and it was overwhelming for them. And they didn't feel like the students walked away, having learned what they were supposed to. But we've also had workshops with 7 people, and the peer educators will come back and tell me that nobody talked, and it went by very quickly, and it wasn't very productive. So every university student body is different, obviously, and your ideal number of students may be very different than ours. But we have found that our most productive workshops, where the peer educators leave the room feeling like they accomplished something and that the students are walking away having learned something, is 10 to 12 people for our 2 peer educators. So another lesson we've learned that I've mentioned now a couple times is that constant refinement is needed based on peer educator and participant feedback. So I always meet with our 2 peer educators the day after the workshop, and we discuss what went well, what didn't, what needs to be changed, and nothing in this workshop is set in stone. So we have always had to be very open to making changes that are necessary, and we have made changes pretty much after every single workshop. Our workshop has also been looked at many times throughout this year by our other peer educators on our team. Having any extra student input is beneficial and offers a new perspective that we may not have considered. It's always important to have student input because ultimately it's students that will be receiving this information, and we want to make sure that it's relevant. And again, similarly, wording is important. If students are riled up about wording, then they are not listening to the peer educators. So in creating workshops and programming that's especially related to controversial topics, it is necessary to pay attention to every single word. And although it's tedious and a little annoying, it makes programs more effective. Approach is everything. So what I tell the peer educators is the attitude that they have when they walk into the room has the ability to completely change how the workshop is going to go and how the students are going to react and what they're going to get out of it. So remaining non-judgmental and relatable is key. So another lesson that we have learned is that some debate is healthy and very, very useful. So cannabis is controversial. So there's always going to be debate in the workshop. And my point here is that debate isn't always a bad thing and can sometimes be useful. We need to have points that are debatable to promote discussion and to engage the students in the workshop. And that is why we have changed the wording again on some of the statements of the fact versus myth section to really promote that discussion and have just a little bit of healthy debate. So now that the workshop is finishing up its first year, we're looking ahead to see how we can grow it and how we can continue to improve it. So what we first want to do is train some more peer educators in the facilitation of the workshop, which we have already started to do, which is great. The first step in training a new peer educator is to have them sit in on the workshop as a mole and to observe how it goes. So Hope and Maddie, who are our two peer educators that are the ones that started, who were originally trained in the facilitation of the workshop, can really take the lead here on this and provide the other peer educators with some tips and tricks for facilitating the workshop. Again, the workshop will need to be continuously refined based on both participant feedback, but also on updated scientific information. So new cannabis research pops up every single day, and it's important to keep up. And finally, we're looking to do some more long-term evaluation of the workshop. Like I mentioned earlier, we do have students fill out a very brief survey. It's about 8 questions at the end of the workshop, but we want to have some more long-term data. We're not entirely sure what this is going to look like yet, but we are hoping to reach back out to participants a couple months after the workshop to see if they actually made any changes to their behavior and to see what information they retained from the workshop. Something else that we hope to do is to take a close look at violation records to see if any of the participants that attend our workshop get a second violation after the workshop. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I'm going to open it up to questions, but if any of you have any questions at a later point, please don't reach out, do not hesitate to reach out to me via email. My email is rna25@miami.edu. Also, please feel free to follow the Sandler Center on Instagram at Sandler Center if you want to get a better idea of what we do and some of our programs. But thank you so much again. Please let me know if you have any questions about the workshop, about the Sandler Center, some of our other programming. I'd be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. We do have a few minutes, so for all of the attendees, if you have any questions in regards to the session that we had today, feel free to type them into that question box, and then we will address those questions. And we currently I do have one question for you, Rachel. Have any of your peer educators maybe ran into students that you know of that have challenged them and maybe asked them if they use personally and kind of how that was handled or how you would suggest that be handled?
Yeah, that actually does happen a lot. The students in the workshop will, in their challenging of the peer educators, ask if our own peer educators use cannabis. And I find that our peer educators handle this pretty well. They usually kind of laugh it off and make a joke, but they'll say, this isn't about us. This is about you. They'll kind of make a joke that, you're the ones that are caught, and,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just there to provide them with factual information. But the approach that our peer educators usually take in questions like that and in other questions is to usually just kind of laugh it off and move on. And I think that goes back to their relatability as students, and creating a kind of fun atmosphere that people feel comfortable, talking and asking questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And we do have a few question submissions, so I will read those to you now.
Great.
One person asked, in the creation of this program, Did you involve or solicit feedback from any campus partners or other offices on your campus?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this workshop has been looked at by the staff from the Dean of Students office. That's one office, and uh, I believe it has also been looked at by other offices that are involved in the conduct process, such as the Counseling Center and the UM Police Department. But I think that that is a really great next step to show it to even more of our campus partners that we collaborate with and get their feedback on. I think that's a really great idea and something that we can definitely do in the future.
Perfect. And another one is, how do you interface with the counseling center?
Oh yeah. So I don't have a very deep understanding of our conduct process, but there are many of the students that are attending this workshop have either been referred by the counseling center or that's also part of the process. So while I am not directly involved in the counseling center's process and how that relates to the conduct process as a whole, many of these students are attending the counseling center as part of their, it's mandated as part of the process.
Thank you. We have a few more that have been submitted. We have an attendee that asked, how did you go about or did you check the fidelity in the implementation of the sessions?
Sure. So I actually have sat in on one of the sessions. I look pretty young, so I can pass for an undergraduate student. So I sat in on one of them. And then again, I meet with our peer educators after every single workshop, either that night or the day after. And I ask very specific questions and I ask, we go through basically every single section of the workshop and I ask, how did you describe this part or what questions did you ask here? How did the students respond? And go pretty in depth to ensure that our peer educators are really hitting all of the sections and asking all of the important questions and not just racing through and getting out of the workshop in 20 minutes. I think that that's really important
Mhm.
to do.
For sure. We got a lot of questions, which is awesome.
Oh, great.
How do you encourage attendance and is it mandatory after a sanction?
Yes, so this is a mandatory session that they have to attend to as part of the conduct process. So my boss, the assistant dean of students, and the director of the Sandler Center will send a very strongly worded email to students twice before the workshop just to let them know when it is and when they're supposed to attend. We usually get about 95% attendance. There are usually some students that just don't show up, and that's taken care of by the dean of students office. But it is mandatory, and from the email, they know that, and they usually show up.
Perfect. And then we have another one. Do you see the need for or value in adapting this program to deliver it to a larger student population as more of a primary prevention approach to cannabis use?
Yes, definitely. And this is something that I've discussed with my boss because I am leaving this position because I've graduated. And one of the goals that we have for the person that is taking over my position is to adapt this workshop for many different ways. So yes, to kind of have it as a primary prevention approach for kind of everyone, but also to adapt it to other specific populations. So as something that can maybe presented to our Greek life organizations or other student groups so that we definitely see the value in that. And that is one of our main goals in the workshops next year. So good question.
Yeah, that's awesome. Have you ever used or are you familiar with e-toke at all in your intervention for self-reflection, like attitudes and behaviors and things like that?
No, that is not something I have heard of, but
Yeah,
I'd be
me
happy to
either.
look it
I'll have to check it out. Yeah. And then we have one final one for right now, at least. Are your peer educators paid?
Yes, that is a great question. They are paid. And I think that that is important to note. And I actually meant to include that. They are paid. We have 6 of them. So this is a job for them. So they're very dedicated to it, and they have to, do a certain number of things throughout the semester and year to remain a peer educator.
Perfect. Well, at this time, that is all we have. So I want to thank you, Rachel, for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. And also, congratulations on your new position and best of luck. But we really
Thank you so
appreciate you
much.
taking the time to present for us and all of the attendees. And thank you to the attendees as well who have joined us today. Really appreciate that. For those who are in attendance, please keep an eye out for an email from the GoToWebinar platform because in that email there will be a link for you to fill out an evaluation form, and this will help us in planning future events. So with that being said, I think we can conclude today's session. Thank you again to the attendees, and thank you, Rachel, for the awesome presentation.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Everyone have a good day. Goodbye.